Learn English through stories, E43 PDF. Adapted and modified by Kulwant Singh Sandhu. Contents: 1. Those three bears. 2. When the tree walked. 3. Goodbye, Mrs. Mackenzie. 4. Grammar page. 1. Those three bears. By Ruskin Bond. Most Himalayan villages lie in the valleys, where there are small streams, some farmland, and protection from the biting winds that come through the mountain passes in winter. The houses are usually made of large stones and have sloping slate roofs, so the heavy monsoon rain can run off easily. During the sunny autumn months, the roofs are often covered with pumpkins, left there to ripen in the sun. One October night, when I was sleeping at a friend's house in a village in these hills, I was awakened by a rumbling and thumping on the roof. I woke my friend and asked him what was happening. "It's only a bear," he said. "Is it trying to get in?" "No, it's after the pumpkins." A little later, when we looked out of a window, we saw a black bear making off through a field, leaving a trail of half-eaten pumpkins. In winter, when snow covers the higher ranges, the Himalayan bears come to lower altitudes in search of food. Sometimes they forage in fields, and because they are short-sighted and suspicious of anything that moves, they can be dangerous. But, like most wild animals, they avoid humans as much as possible. Village folk always advise me to run downhill if chased by a bear. They say bears find it easier to run uphill than down. I am yet to be chased by a bear and will happily skip the experience. But I have seen a few of these mountain bears in India, and they are always fascinating to watch. Himalayan bears enjoy pumpkins, corn, plums, and apricots. Once, while I was sitting in an oak tree hoping to see a pair of pine martens that lived nearby, I heard the whining grumble of a bear, and presently a small bear ambled into the clearing beneath the tree. He was little more than a cub, and I was not alarmed. I sat very still, waiting to see what he would do. He put his nose to the ground and sniffed his way along until he came to a large anthill. Here he began huffing and puffing, blowing rapidly in and out of his nostrils, so that the dust from the anthill flew in all directions. But the anthill had been deserted, and so, grumbling, the bear made his way up a nearby plum tree. Soon he was perched high in the branches. It was then that he saw me. The bear at once scrambled several feet higher up the tree and lay flat on a branch. Since it wasn't a very big branch, there was a lot of bear showing on either side. He tucked his head behind another branch. He could no longer see me, so he apparently is satisfied that he was hidden, although he couldn't help grumbling. Like all bears, this one was full of curiosity. So slowly, inch by inch, his black snout appeared over the edge of the branch. As soon as he saw me, he drew his head back and hid his face. He did this several times. I waited until he wasn't looking, then moved some way down my tree. When the bear looked over and saw that I was missing, he was so pleased that he stretched right across to another branch and helped himself to a plum. I couldn't help bursting into laughter. The startled young bear tumbled out of the tree, dropped through the branches some 15 feet, and landed with a thump in a pile of dried leaves. He was unhurt, but fled from the clearing, grunting and squealing all the way. Another time, my friend Prem told me, a bear had been active in his cornfield. We took up a post at night in an old cattle shed, which gave a clear view of the moonlit field. A little after midnight, a female bear came down to the edge of the field. She seemed to sense that we had been about. She was hungry, however. So, after standing on her hind legs and peering around to make sure the field was empty, she came cautiously out of the forest. Her attention was soon distracted by some Tibetan prayer flags which had been strung between two trees. She gave a grunt of disapproval and began to back away, but the fluttering of the flags was a puzzle that she wanted to solve. So she stopped and watched them. Soon the bear advanced to within a few feet of the flags, examining them from various angles. Then, seeing that they posed no danger, she went right up to the flags and pulled them down. Grunting with apparent satisfaction, she moved into the field of corn. Prem had decided that he didn't want to lose any more of his crop, so he started shouting. His children woke up and soon came running from the house, banging on empty kerosene tins. Deprived of her dinner, the bear made off in a bad temper. She ran downhill at a good speed, and I was glad that I was not in her way. Uphill or downhill, an angry bear is best given a very wide path. 2. When the trees walked. One morning, while I was sitting beside grandfather on the veranda steps, I noticed the tendril of a creeping vine trailing nearby. As we sat there in the soft sunshine of a North Indian winter, I saw the tendril moving slowly towards grandfather. 20 minutes later, it had crossed the step and was touching his feet. There's probably a scientific explanation for the plant's behavior, something to do with light and warmth perhaps, but I like to think it moved across the steps simply because it wanted to be near grandfather. One always felt like drawing close to him. Sometimes when I sat by myself beneath a tree, I would feel rather lonely, but as soon as grandfather joined me, the garden became a happy place. Grandfather had served many years in the Indian Forest Service, and it was natural that he should know trees and like them. On his retirement, he built a bungalow on the outskirts of Dehradun, planting trees all around. Lime, mango, orange, and guava, also eucalyptus, jacaranda, and Persian lilacs. In the fertile Dune Valley, plants and trees grew tall and strong. There were other trees in the compound before the house was built, including an old peepal that had forced its way through the walls of an abandoned outhouse, knocking the bricks down with its vigorous growth. Peepal trees are great show-offs. Even when there is no breeze, their broad-chested, slim-waisted leaves will spin like tops determined to attract your attention and invite you into the shade. Grandmother had wanted the peepal tree cut down, but grandfather had said, "Let it be, we can always build another outhouse." Grandmother didn't mind trees, but she preferred growing flowers and was constantly ordering catalogs and seeds. Grandfather helped her out with the gardening, not because he was crazy about flower gardens, but because he liked watching butterflies, and there's only one way to attract butterflies, he said, and that is to grow flowers for them. Grandfather wasn't content with growing trees in our compound. During the rains, he would walk into the jungle beyond the riverbed armed with cuttings and saplings, which he would plant in the forest. But no one ever comes here. I had protested the first time we did this. Who's going to see them? "See, we're not planting them simply to improve the view," replied grandfather. "We're planting them for the forest and for the animals and birds who live here and need more food and shelter. Of course, men need trees too," he added, "to keep the desert away, to attract rain, to prevent the banks of rivers from being washed away, for fruit and flowers, leaf and seed. Yes, for timber too. But men are cutting down trees without replacing them, and if we don't plant a few trees ourselves, a time will come when the world will be one great desert." The thought of a world without trees became a sort of nightmare to me, and I helped grandfather in his tree planting with greater enthusiasm. And while we went about our work, he taught me a poem by George Morris. "Woodman, spare that tree, touch not a single bough. In youth it sheltered me, and I'll protect it now." "One day the trees will move again," said grandfather. "They've been standing still for thousands of years, but there was a time when they could walk about like people. Then along came an interfering busybody who cast a spell over them, rooting them to one place, but they're always trying to move, see how they reach out with their arms, and some of them, like the banyan tree with its traveling aerial roots, manage to get quite far. We found an island, a small rocky island, in a dry riverbed. It was one of those riverbeds so common in the foothills, which are completely dry in summer but flooded during the monsoon rains. A small mango was growing on the island. "If a small tree can grow here," said grandfather, "so can others." As soon as the rains set in, and while rivers could still be crossed, we set out with a number of tamarind, laburnum, and coral tree saplings and cuttings, and spent the day planting them on the island. The monsoon season was the time for rambling about. At every turn, there was something new to see. Out of the earth and rock and leafless boughs, the magic touch of the rains had brought life and greenness. You could see the broad-leaved vines growing. Plants sprang up in the most unlikely of places. A peepal would take root in the ceiling. A mango would sprout on the windowsill. We did not like to remove them, but they had to go if the house was to be kept from falling down. "If you want to live in a tree, that's all right by me," said grandmother crossly. "But I like having a roof over my head, and I'm not going to have my roof brought down by the jungle." Then came the Second World War, and I was sent away to a boarding school. During the holidays, I went to live with my father in Delhi. Meanwhile, my grandparents sold the house and went to England. 2 or 3 years later, I too went to England and was away from India for several years. Some years later, I returned to Dehradun. After first visiting the old house, it hadn't changed much. I walked out of town towards the river bed. It was February. As I looked across the dry watercourse, I was immediately caught by the spectacular red blooms of the coral blossom. In contrast with the dry riverbed, the island was a small green paradise. When I went up to the trees, I noticed that some squirrels were living in them, and a crow pheasant, challenged me with a mellow, "Who are you? Who are you?" But the trees seemed to know me. They whispered among themselves and beckoned me nearer. And looking around, I noticed that other smaller trees, wild plants and grasses, had sprung up under their protection. Yes, the trees we had planted long ago had multiplied. They were walking again. In one small corner of the world, grandfather's dream had come true. 3. Goodbye, Miss Mackenzie. Oaks, Holly Mount, the parsonage, the Pines, Dumbarnie, Mackenzie Hall, and Windermere. These are names of some of the old houses that still stand on the outskirts of one of the larger Indian hill stations. They were built over 100 years ago by British settlers who sought relief from the searing heat of the plains. A few fell into decay and are now inhabited by wild cats, owls, goats, and the occasional mule. Driver. Others survive. Among these old mansions stands a neat, whitewashed cottage, Mulberry Lodge, and in it lived an elderly British spinster named Miss Mackenzie. She was sprightly and wore old-fashioned, but well-preserved dresses. Once a week, she walked up to town and bought butter, jam, soap, and sometimes a bottle of eau de cologne. Miss Mackenzie had lived there since her teens. Before World War I, her parents, brother, and sister were all dead. She had no relatives in India and lived on a small pension and gift parcels sent by a childhood friend. She had few visitors: the local padre, the postman, the milkman. Like other lonely old people, she kept a pet, a large black cat with bright yellow eyes. In a small garden, she grew dahlias, chrysanthemums, gladioli, and a few rare orchids. She knew a great deal about wild flowers, trees, birds, and insects. She never seriously studied them, but had an intimacy with all that grew and flourished around her. It was September, and the rains were nearly over. Miss Mackenzie's African marigolds were blooming. She hoped the coming winter wouldn't be too severe, because she found it increasingly difficult to bear the cold. One day, as she was puttering about in her garden, she saw a schoolboy plucking wild flowers on the slope above the cottage. "What are you up to, young man?" she called. Alarmed, the boy tried to dash up the hillside, but slipped on pine needles and slid down the slope into Miss Mackenzie's nasturtium bed. Finding no escape, he gave a bright smile and said, "Good morning, miss." Good morning, said Miss Mackenzie severely. Would you mind moving out of my flower bed? The boy stepped gingerly over the nasturtiums and looked at Miss Mackenzie with appealing eyes. You ought to be in school, she said. What are you doing here? Picking flowers, miss? He held up a bunch of ferns and wild flowers. Oh, Miss Mackenzie was disarmed. It had been a long time since she had seen a boy taking an interest in flowers. Do you like flowers? She asked. Yes, miss. I'm going to be a botanist. You mean a botanist? Yes, miss. That's unusual. Do you know the names of these flowers? This is a buttercup, he said, showing her a small golden flower. But I don't know what this is, he said, holding out a pale pink flower with a heart-shaped leaf. It's a wild begonia, said Miss Mackenzie. And that purple stuff is salvia. Do you have any books on flowers? No, miss. Come in and I'll show you one. She led the boy into a small front room crowded with furniture, books, vases, and jam jars. He sat awkwardly on the edge of the chair. The cat jumped immediately onto his knees and settled down, purring softly. What's your name? Asked Miss Mackenzie as she rummaged through her books. Anno, miss. And where do you live? When school closes, I go to Delhi. My father has a business there. Oh, and what's that? Bulbs, miss. Flower bulbs, no electric bulbs. Ah, here we are, she said, taking a heavy tome from the shelf. Flora Himalayensis, published in 1892, and probably the only copy in India. This is a valuable book, Anil. No other naturalist has recorded as many wild Himalayan flowers, but there are still many plants unknown to the botanists who spend all their time at microscopes instead of in the mountains. Perhaps you'll do something about that one day. Yes, miss. She lit the stove and put the kettle on for tea, and then the old English lady and the small Indian boy sat side by side, absorbed in the book. Miss Mackenzie pointed out many flowers that grew around the hill station, while the boy made notes of their names and seasons. May I come again? Asked Daniel, when finally he rose to go. If you like, said Miss Mackenzie. But not during school hours. You mustn't miss your classes. After that, Anil visited Miss Mackenzie about once a week, and nearly always brought a wild flower for her to identify. She looked forward to the boy's visits. Sometimes when more than a week passed and he didn't come, she would grumble at the cat. By the middle of October, with only a fortnight left before school closed, snow fell on the distant mountains. One peak stood high above the others, a white pinnacle against an azure sky. When the sun set, the peak turned from orange to pink to red. How high is that mountain? Asked Daniel. It must be over 15,000 feet, said Miss Mackenzie. I always wanted to go there, but there is no proper road. On the lower slopes, there'll be flowers that you don't get here, blue gentian, purple columbine. The day before school closed, Anil came to say goodbye. As he was about to leave, Miss Mackenzie thrust the Flora Himalayensis into his hands. It's a gift, she said. But I'll be back next year, and I'll be able to look at it then, he protested. Besides, it's so valuable. That's why I'm giving it to you. Otherwise, it will fall into the hands of the junk dealers. But, miss, don't argue. The boy tucked the book under his arm, stood at attention, and said, Goodbye, Miss Mackenzie. It was the first time he had spoken her name. Strong winds soon brought rain and sleet, killing the flowers in the garden. The cat stayed indoors, curled up at the foot of the bed. Miss Mackenzie wrapped herself in old shawls and mufflers, but still felt cold. Her fingers grew so stiff that it took almost an hour to open a can of baked beans. And it snowed, and for several days the milkman did not come. Tired, she spent most of her time in bed. It was the warmest place. She kept a hot water bottle against her back, and the cat kept her feet warm. She dreamed of spring and summer. In 3 months the primroses would be out, and Aniel would return. One night the hot water bottle burst, soaking the bed. The sun didn't shine for several days, and the blankets remained damp. Miss Mackenzie caught a chill and had to keep to her cold, uncomfortable bed. A strong wind sprang up one night and blew the bedroom window open. Miss Mackenzie was too weak to get up and close it. The wind swept the rain and sleet into the room. The cat snuggled close to its mistress's body. Towards morning, the body lost its warmth, and the cat left the bed and started scratching about on the floor. As sunlight streamed through the window, the milkman arrived. He poured some milk into the saucer on the doorstep, and the cat jumped down from the windowsill. The milkman called out a greeting to Miss Mackenzie. There was no answer. Knowing she was always up before sunrise, he poked his head in the open window and called again. Miss Mackenzie did not answer. She had gone to the mountain where the blue gentian and purple columbine grow. 4. Grammar page.